Hi everyone, my name is Mike Cook. I'm a member of the Knives and Paintbrushes Research Collective, and I'm also a research fellow at Queen Mary University of London, although I wasn't when I performed this work, for reasons I'll explain to you at the end of the talk. This paper is called Optimists at Heart, Why Do We Research Game AI? So for all of us here at CoG this year, whether you're a game AI researcher or not, your work is motivated by lots of different factors. That might be to be remembered, to leave a mark on other people, to educate the masses, or it might be to study really hard and go and get a good job in the games industry or in academia. All of these motivations affect every little decision we make. It affects things like where we choose to go and work, the kinds of problems we try and solve, who we ask for money to try and solve them, and who we collaborate with to work on those problems with that money in those places. These motivations are super complex and they affect our personal and professional lives. And my motivation for writing this paper came from thinking about what motivated me to do my everyday research, all of these questions that I've just asked. And I realized that thinking about motivations is useful, especially thinking about the whole field, because it lets us chart out the future, it lets us figure out where we're going, what we're interested in. And it lets us see what things might be blocking us from doing certain types of research or asking certain types of questions. And I think there's also just something really valuable about reflecting on our own processes from time to time. And I found this a really pleasant and satisfying paper to write. Now, I'm not going to go over the whole paper today. Instead, I'm going to pick out some highlights for you, and hopefully that will tempt you into reading the full thing. So the first is our publications. This is the first thing I did, was to survey essentially all of the publications that we put out at CoG last year. And the reason I did that is because in 50 years' time, or maybe if we just all quit game AI tomorrow, if people want to figure out what our field was doing in the year 2022, they're going to come and look at CoG's proceedings and read those papers, because that is the archive of a research field. So what do those papers tell us? What story are they going to leave behind? Well, I looked through every AI-related paper last year published at the conference, and I was looking for any evidence of motivation in these papers, especially explicit motivation sections. And what I found was that, by and large, almost no paper published last year had explicit motivations behind their work in the papers. There was some indirect evidence of motivation, in particular things like what the authors expected the work to be applied to do. And so I did end up breaking down a few categories of where papers were suggesting their impact might lie. So one of those categories, for example, was access. So things like either providing access to, say, game development for people who might not have particular technical skills, or providing access to game playing for people who have certain accessibility needs, mental or physical. Then we've got this section in the middle with cost and business in. So this is kind of improving the way we already do things. So cost might be making an algorithm more efficient, for example, whereas the business section might be things like gamification, analyzing players, figuring out monetization strategies. So these are how can we make the current games industry more efficient. And then the red ones on the right-hand side, this is more about novelty and inventing the future. So capability might be making something possible that wasn't before. So this could be a new AI technique, it could be a new game mechanic. Whereas the new games category is more those kind of rare papers where a researcher has actually created an entire game that you can download and play and is a valuable contribution to the history of games in its own right. So there clearly are some categories that we can identify here, but it's not telling us the full story. So from publications, we can go a step up and look instead at the researchers who write those publications and try and figure out what their motivations are. So in order to do this, I read about a field called the sociology of science, and I read a load of really interesting papers about how scientists work. And in particular, one by Professor Alice Lamb, written in 2013, broke down the motivations for researchers into three categories, what she called puzzles, ribbons, and gold. So puzzles are things like satisfying your curiosity, just wanting to do something for the sake of doing it. Then there's ribbons. Ribbons is prestige. There's a nice section where I talk about the history of scientists being motivated by prestige and its role in how academia works. These are things like winning awards for best paper, competitions, getting exposure in the press maybe, promotions. And then finally there's gold, what economists call pecuniary rewards. So this is stuff you can spend, essentially. So this is things like patenting a new idea, creating a startup or a spin-off, or doing consultancy, whether that's for a big tech firm like Facebook or maybe a smaller game developer. So in order to figure out where this fit into our field, I conducted a survey by contacting the first author for every paper published at CoG and AID last year. And I also invited them to invite their co-authors to fill out this survey as well. We ended up with about 30 responses. There's slightly fewer mentioned in the paper. Some came in late. So let's take a look at this data. So at the beginning of the survey, I had some qualitative questions, and then later on we asked people to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 how important certain factors were in their research. So the first factor was personal interest. This ranked very highly. So on average, most people it was really important to them that the problems they worked on was something that motivated them, that was personally interesting and engaging. The next category, and the least important category, was that your work produced products or things that could be patented, essentially something that you could sell. So this was rated pretty low. The next one is what I've called academic metrics. So this is things like publishing in conferences and journals that are very highly ranked, maybe winning a best paper award, anything that can get you promotion or tenure. How important is it that your research does this for you? You can see this is kind of middling. Industry applications, how important is it that your research is applicable to the games industry, that game developers go and use it in order to make their games. And finally, benefit to the wider field of AI. So you invent an algorithm for solving a particular problem, but it also has applications to evolutionary computing, or it has applications to other applied fields of AI. So you can see there's a spread of responses here with one clear winner and one clear loser, and then some other categories in the middle. What's kind of interesting is that there's a more pronounced difference once you break it down by age category. So there were several age buckets that people could put themselves into, but I've broken it down into 2 here, which is under and over 30. And you can see here that although personal interest is very important to both of these groups, we see that there's a marked difference in all of the other categories. If you're under 30, you're much less likely to be interested in any of these other than, does this topic excite you, basically. So let's think a little bit about what that's telling us. So first of all, even though personal interest is unanimously and overwhelmingly important to almost everyone that filled out this survey, we didn't see it anywhere when we performed a survey of the publications that were actually posted last year. Now this might seem obvious, but it seems curious to me that we don't see any evidence of personal passion or interest or excitement when we write these papers up, especially when there are so many people with really interesting skills and interests, like being ex-professional players or ex-game designers. I feel like we should see more of that stuff in our papers. The second thing that's interesting in contrast to Lam's work is that in game AI, even though there's a lot of opportunity for big impact in the world, we don't see a lot of people doing what Lam would consider to be hybrid commercial work, so commercializing research, startups, things like that. There are a few notable exceptions, things like Model AI or a couple of colleagues who work for Facebook, but in general we don't seem to be a field which is super interested in money. Now, Lam points out that there could be, one of the reasons for this is what she calls social desirability bias. So in other words, during her interviews, she observed that a lot of people didn't want to say that they were motivated by money because there was a sense that the interviewer might judge them or that it was not a thing that you could freely admit to. So they often gave coy excuses or things like that. And that could be what's going on here. People might not want to say that that's something they're interested in when actually it would be if they were given the opportunity. Another interesting thing is when we perform this age breakdown. So I think there's a few ways to interpret this under 30 versus over 30 divide. One is that there's a generational change coming and that people under the age of 30 have very different priorities. Another way of thinking about it is that people over 30 are much more likely to have permanent, secure jobs, and that might be something which alters people's priorities. They might be more concerned about promotions, getting funding, having kind of influence in the world, which is what a lot of these other categories were relating to. It's also worth noting that people under 30 are more likely to be people who are going to get forced out of academia, who might not be able to afford to stay in, or academia is an incredibly brutal profession that kicks out a lot of people for various reasons: burnout, unavailability of jobs, the two-body problem, all of this stuff. So what we might be seeing is evidence that there's a generation with different priorities who, not all of whom maybe are going to get a chance to stay here and express those priorities through their work. So either way, I think there is something really interesting here that might be worth following up with a larger study in the future. So the third category, institutions, is kind of a chunky one, and so instead I'm just going to focus on one topic from it and ignore kind of the others for the paper. So what I want to talk to you about is big tech. Now, I know some of you may work for big tech companies, some of you may want to work for them, or some of you may just have a friendly relationship with them. But the important thing that I want to tell you today is that unfortunately, although the people that work at these places, I'm sure, are very nice and well motivated, the company itself does not have our best interests at heart. And in fact, for university researchers, we have a lot of things that are really valuable to these companies. We have a steady stream of graduates that they need to apply for their jobs. We have a university brand that adds legitimacy to, project collaborations and things like that. And among the general public, we have the perception of being an independent voice. So university researchers quoted in the press talking up OpenAI, for example, that's really good for OpenAI because the public see these researchers as people who have an independent voice. That's the function of a university researcher in many ways. So big tech's aware of all of these things, they know how to get them, and they frequently do. And in the paper, I talk about some research called the Grey Hoodie Project by Abdallah and Abdallah. And they analyze big tech and compare its behavior to big tobacco in the past, when they also wanted to kind of dominate the public discussion around tobacco. And so they find really fascinating things, like they analyze the five top US universities, and their computer science departments are just full of people who have had some kind of funding linked to big tech in their recent careers. 85% of academics in these universities that they study. And they show that there is a lot of evidence that big tech is able to influence research priorities, affect where graduates want to go and work, and change the opinions that researchers publish and say to the press. And I think it is worth thinking how immune we really are to the PR firms and the schmoozing and the funding that comes out of the big tech sector, and how much it affects the research priorities, maybe not of us consciously, but maybe of the universities we work at, maybe the funding agencies, the governments, other groups that we are interacting with and at the mercy of. So on that controversial note, I'm going to move to the conclusions. So Game AI is motivated by loads of different things. We talked about that right at the beginning, all of the different things that drive us to come to a place like this to share our ideas with one another. And yet it does seem that there are things motivating us that we don't get a chance to share or leave behind in the record of the work that we do. Now, one reason for that might be that there are so many enormous organizations that are affecting our work in big and small ways. I'm not just talking about big tech, I'm talking about government agencies, I'm talking about academic institutions, our own employers, all of these things. And we're just sort of swept around, helplessly. We're all going to have our motivation shifted because there's just so much happening around us and so much that we need to be aware of. So in the paper, I talk about some problems that this might cause, but I don't have time to talk about them today. So instead, I'm going to talk to you about what we can do. I propose a few solutions in the paper, but one thing I want to talk to you about right now is the idea that we can work together. So this paper was written while on strike at Queen Mary University of London. Queen Mary instituted brutal tactics to try and break our strike, even though the only things we were really asking for was to discuss things like equality and burnout, and to have an increase to our pay during a historic period of inflation and recession. Now, just a week ago, the union did sign a deal with Queen Mary. They capitulated, they've given us a small amount of wage increase, and they've agreed to look at things like the pension plan in the future. And the union is preparing for, another year of trying to get the university to care about this stuff. But it proves that change can happen and that things can be won. And I think that we can also change our research field. We can change things about it that we don't like. And I know that that can be a little bit far-fetched at times. It can feel like things like the concept of tenure, or the concept of a funding agency, or the concept of peer review, they've always been here. How could we possibly change them? Well, the title of this talk comes from a game called Alpha Centauri, which was published in 1999, of all things, and it goes like this. The full quote says, "The popular image of the scientist is that of a skeptic and a pessimist. Nothing could be further from the truth. Scientists must be optimists at heart, to block out the incessant chorus of those who say it cannot be done." And I think that's true not just of research questions, but of all of the questions that we have about our field, what it does in the world, and what it wants to be in the future. I look forward to working together with you to solve some of these problems, and I look forward to seeing you probably in the Q&A right now, but if not, at the next conference that we happen to be at. Thanks so much for listening.